In preparation for the trip to Cuba, one of the warnings was to never use the Spanish question word, why? That was quite a shock. Adult Cubans have long stopped asking themselves that question. But perhaps there is still hope among the youth.
Bienvenidos a Cuba!
Cuba had already been in crisis for a long time due to a decades-long blockade. But what was the state of the country after 2 years without tourism because of the COVID pandemic? Meanwhile, the situation has only worsened, with exploding oil tanks and sometimes days-long power outages across the entire country. The ration books, which allow people to buy a limited number of basic products, were introduced after the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and were intended to be temporary until the country stabilized. However, 60 years later, they are still in use, and the lines for stores are longer than ever. Emotions sometimes run high over the scarce availability of chicken. Even in the countryside, fresh milk is rarely or never available. Buying a few bread rolls made from wheat and cornmeal is a daily ordeal. The extremely slow bureaucracy makes standing in line the main daily pastime. Often leading to scuffles. Cigarettes are only available on the street. People don't just queue for food but also for soap, toothpaste, diapers, and similar essentials. To prevent riots in the queues, the police and military are omnipresent. The military is everywhere, but no longer to defend the country against an invasion. The last attempt at that was in 1961. 2 years after the revolution against the previous dictator, Batista. Now, the army is also deployed to maintain order. People don't just stand in long lines daily, sometimes for nothing, at ration stores, but also for all administrative procedures. Except the ration stores for basic products, where people pay in the local currency, the peso, there are countless state-run shops where other products are sometimes available. However, payments can only be made by credit card, even for Cubans, with prices listed in expensive euros or dollars. These state-run shops are not just for the wealthy but for anyone who needs diapers, tomato paste, coffee, pasta, toilet paper, and similar essentials. Even photocopiers are state property and making copies is strictly regulated. Pharmacies are another painful story. The shelves are usually almost empty. Here, people must check daily to see which products might be available. In Vinales, however, a few items miraculously are in stock. Even in Varadero, the so-called luxury beach destination, the situation is even worse. They only have cotton swabs, mosquito spray, and sunscreen. As a result, medicines are sold on the street.
They're coming from Russia.
Sometimes even in bulk. Fallen off the truck is a familiar term here as well. The only things that are readily available are rum and beer. This situation only exists in state-run shops. Although Cuba gets enough rain, it still struggles to provide sufficient drinking water. As a result, even mineral water has to be imported. After a long Spanish colonization, Cuba came under the influence of the United States at the end of the 19th century. In 1959, dictator Batista was overthrown during the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro and his companion, the Argentine Che Guevara, who was executed in Bolivia in 1967 while trying to spread his ideology there. Fidel Castro remained president of Cuba until 2006. Cuba was supported by the Soviet Union at the time, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961 when the Soviet Union attempted to place nuclear weapons on Cuba. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, Cuba lost much of its economic support. Initially, there were some successes in the underdeveloped country in terms of education, health, and emancipation, among others, but due to the long-standing blockade by the United States, much of this progress was undone. The evolution of Cuba into a totalitarian dictatorship has not helped to end the blockade. The hope for some democratization has not materialized, quite the opposite. Apart from a negligible easing of private ownership, nothing has changed. The many spontaneous remarks from Cubans to tourists certainly don't sound revolutionary.
We are hungry, very hungry, very hungry. We are not free.
In Cuba, you can end up in prison for treason against the revolution from 65 years ago. Almost no one alive today actually experienced. Since 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States has imposed a lockdown on many products. The cause of many of the problems Cuba is currently facing is often conveniently attributed to this blockade. Cuba's national slogan, "Homeland or Death," was widely altered during the protests of July 2021 to the parody, "Homeland and Life." But after those protests, the government in Cardenas plastered the entire city with slogans in the vain hope of reigniting the revolutionary spirit among the youth. In Santiago de Cuba, we find ourselves in a street of a neighborhood president and a neighborhood supervisor, both of whom have also plastered their area with revolutionary slogans. In 2022, these oil storage tanks were blown up by lightning strike, leaving the country largely without electricity. This situation has repeated itself regularly, as seen in 2024 and 2025, when all of Cuba was without electricity for several days. Cuba often emphasizes that it has a good healthcare system, but there has been no sign of this. While they frequently send doctors abroad during disasters, at home, they can hardly do anything due to a lack of equipment and empty pharmacy shelves. Here, we do come across a nursing home that is explicitly open to the street, where everything seems to be running smoothly, but it just so happens to be located in the tourist district of Havana. Although Cuba is a fertile country with sufficient rainfall and no overpopulation, there is still a permanent large shortage of food products. More than 50% of the land remains unused. The country tries to import many food products, at least when they have the foreign currency for it. Cuba has always focused on the cultivation of two main crops, sugar and tobacco. Nearly all of this production is bought up by the government because the export of these goods brings in foreign currency, which they can then use to purchase other products abroad. Sugar is grown for the production of Cuban rum, Havana Club, which is almost entirely exported. Cardenas, home to such a rum distillery, was the scene of mass protests in July 2021, a rare and bold occurrence. The president himself came to the city to calm things down, after which many protesters were thrown into prison. Due to the need for foreign currency, tobacco production is prioritized over food production.
Only one demonstration for make this cigar, this size, we need 6.
Almost all of the cigar production is exported. Cuban salaries don't allow locals to afford cigars, except for the tourist photo opportunities. The country that produced its own food until 1960 is now largely dependent on food imports. Potatoes, which are easier to grow than rice, are only produced to a limited extent, mainly for French fries for tourists. After the revolution, private ownership was allowed to decrease from 400 to 67 hectares, thereby eliminating large land ownership. Only after the protests of 2021 did the government relax the regulations regarding the operation of private vegetable gardens. This means they can keep a larger portion of the yield for personal consumption or private sale. However, whether this will solve the food problem is questionable. At the market, there is mainly fruit, mangoes, bananas, and lemons. That's about it. And sometimes pineapples. A large part of the sales takes place on the street. The majority of the meat is exported, also for foreign currency. Only the worst and fattiest pieces are left behind in Cuba. But Cuba is an island and therefore has an enormous supply of fish. Yet, fish is hardly available. The reason is that there are almost no seaworthy fishing boats left. The remaining small boats are mostly used to flee to the United States. Fishing is mostly done with strings, as fishing rods are either barely available or unaffordable. If a large catch is made, it is taken away under police escort. Due to the ongoing fuel shortage, horse-drawn carts and bike taxis are the most reliable means of transportation, both in the countryside and in the cities. For longer distances, these converted trucks are the most commonly used inexpensive means of transport. Long-distance taxis are sometimes an option if you're lucky enough to share with other travelers. But even then, the ordeal isn't over. Gas stations have a habit of taking a 2-hour lunch break. By the way, these stations and shops are all state-owned, so payment must be made by credit card, even for Cubans. Because it is difficult and unaffordable to import cars into Cuba, the old American cars from the mid-20th century are continuously being restored. For many tourists, seeing these classic cars is a reason to come here. Cuba also promotes this as a tourist attraction. For public long-distance buses, payment is often required via Wi-Fi. But if there is no internet or if your app is not installed, you cannot depart. And to get Wi-Fi, one needs a day upon arrival in Havana. Wi-Fi is only available in certain places. Internet in hotels doesn't exist at all. For the city buses, there are long lines everywhere to find a seat. Many buses are also only available to employees of certain companies. There are also many maxi taxis that follow fixed routes, but even here, there are long queues. There is always police presence on the ferries as well. The official exchange rate of the peso in 2022 was 25 pesos for €1, but Cubans pay up to 5 times more on the street to buy euros. At gas stations, state-owned shops, and so on, everyone must pay with bank cards, but these cards need to be loaded with euros. The state needs foreign currency to buy food and fuel. So the entire policy is focused solely on that. The population is constantly on the hunt for euros if they want to buy anything beyond basic products. The dollar is officially banned, although doctors, engineers, technicians, and others earn less than €50 per month, and their emigration is even encouraged by the government, as these emigrants send money back to their families who remain behind. School attendance is mandatory until the age of 15, with a strong focus on Spanish and mathematics. The literacy rate is said to be almost 100%. All education is free. Except in the tourist district of Havana, filming is not allowed in schools. This schoolgirl dared to ask a simple question with a smile. Are you a foreigner? But that turned out to be counter-revolutionary, as she was reprimanded and led away. She is probably still wondering what she did wrong. 90% of Cubans are government employees in administration, many hotels and restaurants, even copy centers, police and military, countless ration shops, state stores, the medical sector, and pharmacies with limited stock, even lemonade shops with just one product, which may or may not be sold out. Reselling a newspaper without registration is impossible here and requires a long, patient bureaucratic process. Here are some construction sites that have been halted for decades but are still being guarded. You can't think of anything too crazy without there being a government job for you. This was and still is one of the principles of the 1959 revolution. Everyone must have a job, whether useful or not, efficient or not. But the salary of all these civil servants is only 20 to 30 euros per month. It's hard to get by with that, especially since it's not exactly cheap here. With so many civil servants maintaining bureaucracy and the ubiquitous government control, there are naturally very few farmers, leading to a large food shortage. To make ends meet, almost every Cuban has another side job after finishing their official work and dealing with daily queues. These extra jobs usually earn more than their government job, which pays just a few dozen euros per month, but they are necessary for survival, unless they have a relative abroad who sends money back. Very visible in the streets are the many private sales, in local pesos, of products that are usually only available in state stores. In this private pawn shop, no jewelry is exchanged anymore, as they haven't had any for a long time, but instead, their daily clothes and underwear are traded. A haircut or shave costs 2 euros here, but how do you manage that with a salary of 20 euros per month? A brief overview of a somewhat atypical tour around Cuba is made. In 1607, Havana became the capital of the Spanish colony, and the city was once the third largest in the Americas. Partly because it was the transit port for the stolen treasures, such as gold and silver, from the Spanish colonies in South America. The Cuban population is now a blend of various cultures. The original population was indigenous, but Spanish colonization caused the native population to quickly diminish and die out. millions of Spaniards emigrated to Cuba, alongside many descendants of African slaves and many other nationalities, especially from the Caribbean. In the years before the revolution, Havana was the liveliest gambling city in Central America, and tourism grew enormously. But the average Cuban, however, noticed little of this, especially with the 1959 revolution's consequences. Old Havana was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. But large parts of Havana are now in a deplorable state. These images are only seen in the tourist areas of Havana, much like this model of an old age home shown to the street. Many tourists barely realize what is happening behind the facades. After the Cuban Revolution, Castro banned the import of American cars. This is why Cuba is now a living car museum, which has also become a tourist attraction. Callejón de Hamel is an iconic alley with vibrant murals and is known for its Afro-Cuban culture. Every Sunday afternoon, free rumba sessions are held. If you're looking for great gastronomy, Cuba is definitely not the place to be. Internet can only be accessed through rare Wi-Fi hotspots, at least if you've managed to get hold of a local SIM card. On Sunday mornings, there are numerous local activities in the town square of Viñales, but strangely, there isn't a single foreign tourist in sight, even though the town is a top tourist destination. The boat trip through a cave, with only Cuban tourists, was still enjoyable. Taking a train in Cuba usually requires patience. For the totally worn-out train from Havana to San Antonio, they waited 3 days because there was no fuel. However, this train journey passed right through daily life in Cuba. You literally ride past the backyards, which look very different from the picturesque, colorful tourist photos, except at regular stops. The train actually stops anywhere a hand is raised. San Antonio, the destination of this train journey, was one of the places of mass protests in the summer of 2021 due to ongoing power outages and fuel shortages. The president himself came here at that time to calm things down, but a year later, thousands of Cubans were sentenced to prison terms of up to 20 years for treason against the revolution from 65 years ago, a cause that today's youth have little to no interest in.
Que yo me siento sarco y a este yo lo saco porque me da asco. No, la verdad que te lo digo, no, me siento palolón. Y la verdad que te lo digo, te he dejado de lado. Soy palolón de estudiado y está nublado.
This park, for the better-off Cuban, is inaccessible by public transport. For half a Cuban day's wage, you can get a hamburger here, made with cornmeal bread, under police supervision. Santa Clara is famous because Che Guevara achieved his key victories here during the 1959 revolution. However, when the national anthem is played, the stance of the Cubans is no longer truly revolutionary. School trips are escorted by the police. Santiago de Cuba is indeed the second largest city in the country, but there was hardly anything to eat. Even in the most expensive hotels, the only available dish was Cuban fricassee, at inflated prices of €20. Across all of Cuba, there wasn't a single fresh tomato to be found, and expensive imported canned tomatoes were only available in state stores on the other side of the country. Most pizzas are therefore without tomatoes and topped with something that is called cheese here. getting away was even more difficult, as payments on the government buses could only be made via the internet, which wasn't available. The final destination for many group trips is the resort town of Varadero, supposedly to recover from the many hardships, but even there is hardly anything available, except at a Russian restaurant where they even served a vegetable soup and Ukrainian borscht. An exceptional experience in Cuba. Even French fries are served here, for which potatoes are grown here and there. The beaches are almost yours alone, if that offers any comfort. In summary, one can only agree with what some Cubans cautiously whispered, that the tourist advertisements give a completely false image of Cuba. Cuba is simply a brutal dictatorship that must maintain itself in order to avoid being held accountable by the people.